That's part of the show. All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsum Shachar Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of Shemer Joshos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos Sha'am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Bennett Goldberg, for an aliyah for the neshama of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Figure Ezel, Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that all of our tefillos Emir Hashem will be niskabel during this holy month. Shmuley and Liba Dinovitz, Le'ilui Nishmas, David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Yitzhak Yitzchak, Aryeh ben Hachav Rabbi Yaakov, Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah, should everyone together with Kol Chol Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu Shel Emir Hashem, bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'Chol Maaseh Yedehem. We'll say with that, let us begin. So we are picking up Emir Hashem. Today's daf is Ayin Beis 72. We are picking up on Ayin Aleph Amud Beis 71b. Where did we leave off? Amalei Markashisha. Perfect. So Amalei Markashisha, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up from the bottom. So Amalei Markashisha read Rav Chisda Rav Ashi. Tashma. So remember again, we're still in the sugya of Mashicha by an Oved Kochavim, right? The Mishnah introduced us to this interesting idea that if you are selling wine to an akum. If you're selling wine to an akum, so how exactly, again, that type of sale needs to be structured in order that the wine doesn't end up becoming yayin nesech while in the possession of the Jew. For if the wine becomes yayin nesech in the possession of the Jew, we're stuck, right? We're stuck. There's really no remedy for that because it's asar ba'ana. So again, essentially the Mishnah said, you got to come to a conclusion on price. Once you come to a conclusion on price, then ultimately, again, whatever the Oved Kochavim afterwards, when he does Mashicha, he's being Mosheich his wine, and if he makes it into Yain Nesech, it's becoming Yain Nesech ultimately again in his possession. So therefore that led to a Machlokes, does Mashicha ultimately work by an Akum? So only Marcus, she's raised Rav Chisda Rav Ashi, Tashma, Hamocher Yeno li Oved Kochavim, so if I sell my wine to an Akum, Pasak Achelo Madad Dama Mutar. So we'll say this is our Mishnah. So if we go ahead and we agree on a price, before, madat literally means measure out, but it means pour. It means pour, which ultimately, again, is part of the Mashicha. And ultimately, again, the proceeds are mutter. Because since there was an agreement on price, therefore, subsequently, when the Oved Kochavim did Mashicha on his wine, the Amrit Mashicha Oved Kochavim Eino Kona. But if you say that Mashicha doesn't work as a kinyan, Amai Dam of Mutarin. Then ultimately, again, if Mashicha doesn't work, that means when the Oved Kochavim starts pouring the wine, he's pouring my wine. He's pouring my wine. If he's pouring my wine, then ultimately, again, if it becomes yain nesach or even stam yenam, then the proceeds from the sale should be unequivocally aser. Hacham, what's the case over here? The aktim le dinar. This is very interesting. The case over here, the Gemara passes, is where the akum went ahead and the akum advanced funds. Rashi says over here, the aktim le dinar. Rashi says over here, it's in the first wide line of Rashi, shektim lo. This is very interesting. So what did the akum do? Let's say we know the barrel is not going to be more, or the wine is not going to be more than $100. So what does the akum do? He gives me a $100 bill. He advances me the money. And ultimately he says, listen, we'll settle up afterwards, and if there's change, you'll return to me any of the change. So the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's the case. So again, this is a different kind of scenario. Why is this different? Because I already have the money in hand. So that already changes the math on all this. Ihachi, ema seifa. If that's the case, look at the end of the Mishnah. Madad, ad shelo pasak, damavus asurin. Then if Allah measured out the wine before the price was set, so the proceeds ultimately again will be usher. But why? But if halacha l'maisa again, if halacha l'maisa the akum advanced me money, then why should it be problematic? So again, he responds back to him. Right, ultimately, Ravashi responds back to Makashisha. According to you, the Amrit Mashicha Kona, you say Mashicha does work. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Amai Reisha damav mutarin v'seifa damav asurin. So again, the kasha now, Rav Kashisha, is back on you. If you're right that this is a case of where the akum advanced the money proactively, and therefore halacha l'maisa, really the Yisrael already has the proceeds of the sale in hand. If that's the case, then there should be no concern of yayin nesach in either of the cases. Yet the Mishnah makes a distinction when the measuring occurred before or after the establishment of the price. The Gemara says, Pasak samcha daite, lo pasak lo samcha daite. The Gemara says something which we kind of understood intuitively from the beginning, but now the Gemara says it explicitly. Essentially, when you have a transaction like this, when there's an agreed upon price, ultimately, again, the Yisrael seller, the Jewish seller, agrees to be makna the wine, and therefore Mashiach will work. When there is no agreed upon price, the Yisrael seller is not willing to go ahead and convey ownership of the wine, which makes perfect sense. And that's the distinction. So when they agree on the price and the Oved Kocham subsequently does Mashiach, it'll work, and therefore, again, the wine is the Oved Kochavim, and ultimately Yisrael can keep the proceeds of the sale. When the price has not been set and Mashiach occurs, so there is no agreement to a transaction because there's no set price. Because of that, if the Oved Kocham touches the wine, it becomes essentially yayin nesach, and the proceeds become prohibited. Incredible. L'didi nami. So therefore, Rav Ashi says, according to me also, afagav dekadim le'dinar, even if money was advanced, see, the advancement of money by itself does not really create the totality of the transaction. Pasak samcha daite, lo pasak lo samcha daite. If ultimately there was an agreement on the price, then the Yisrael is committed, right? And when we say committed is, he's willing to allow the akum to acquire it with Mashiach. If he did not advance money, or if he did not agree on a price, ultimately the Yisrael is not committed to the transaction. Amali Ravina Rav Ashi, so Ravina said Rav Ashi, so both say, so this is very important, right? So first of all, this nugget of information over here is incredibly important because what this is highlighting is the power and the importance of establishing a price. Establishing a price essentially allows the seller to commit to the transaction, even though money has not exchanged hands yet. Non-commitment to a price, what do you have? What do you have if there's no agreement on price? What do you have? You have a conversation. That's pretty much all you have, but with absolutely no transactional teeth. The Gemara goes right. Tashma. Ben Noach nerag apachos mishaver pruta velo nitan liyishava. So both say this is very interesting. A Ben Noach, one of the Shem mitzvos b'nei Noach is theft. Now let us steal. A Ben Noach, interestingly enough, is held liable even for stealing less than a shava pruta, which is fascinating, right? If I steal a shava pruta from another Jew, certainly not good, but I'm not chayiv. What's the logic of that? The logic of that is the assumption is people are mochel on less than a shava pruta. I don't care. It doesn't or it might be annoying, but it doesn't matter to me. So if a Jew steals less than a shava pruta, there's no halachic liability. A Ben Noach, interestingly enough, is held liable even for less than a shava pruta. But interestingly enough, there's no obligation to return the stolen object, which is fascinating, right? So if a Ben Noach steals something less than a shava pruta, he's chayiv. And whenever a Ben Noach is chayiv for violating of Shem Mitzvos B'nei Noach, the Noachide laws, ultimately, again, that liability is a death penalty. So he's chayiv, death penalty for stealing less than a shava pruta. But interestingly enough, he has no obligation to return it to me. Because from my perspective, less than a shava pruta is insignificant. Therefore, there is no obligation to return it, which is quite fascinating. So the Gemara says, now, if you say that Mashiach doesn't work by an akum, Gemara asks such an interesting question. Amai nerag? Why should the akum be held liable? Right? Ultimately, again, he didn't acquire it. If Mashiach doesn't work by an akum, then how would the akum be liable ultimately again for taking my item? To which the Gemara will say, you're right, Mishum Titzare li Yisrael. At the end of the day, do you know why the akum is liable? He's liable ultimately again because he caused me pain. He caused the Jew pain. And as I will say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is positing over here is that the akum liability for stealing less than a shava pruta can't simply be theft. Because if it's theft, ultimately, again, then he'd be obligated to return it. The liability the Gemara wants to suggest ultimately is because he caused pain and discomfort to a Jew. That's the liability. Top of Ayin Base 72a. Omai lo nitan lishavon. So what does it mean that he's not obligated ultimately to return it? De'ena b'toras hishavon. ultimately, again, this is not in the framework of return. Now, what does this mean? Because as we said before, a Jew is mochel on less than a shavaruda, right? And therefore, because there's mechila, therefore the akum has no obligation ultimately to return it. Ihachi, if that's the case, listen to this. Ema seifa, look at the end. Look at the end of that Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Listen to this. So akum 1 steals from me less than a shavapruta. Then akum 2 steals from akum 1 the same item. What's the halacha? Akum 2 is liable. Akum 2 is liable, death penalty. Simar says, 1 second. So I understand why Akum 1 is subject to a death penalty. Why? Because he caused pain to me, the Jew. Ella seifa my avid. But what did Akum 2 do? What did Akum 2 do? Ella, what do you see from here? Shmamina, Meshicha ba'ovid kochavim kona shmamina. Rather, what you have to see, Abosai, is this whole thing only makes sense if really there's real theft. Right? So Akum 1, when he steals from me, is a thief. Why? Because Meshicha works. And then when Akum 2 steals from Akum 1, he's going to be liable as well. Why? Because it's also theft. Therefore, this Gemara says, what do you see from here? That Meshicha is a bona fide form of acquisition, a bona fide kinyan by an Akum. And this is incredibly important. Meshicha, not all kinyanim that we have as Jews work by Akum. Right, work by Akum, and which makes sense because a lot of kinyan, remember again, I learned out midaraisa. So not everything works, but ultimately, for example, like we know kinyan kesef works by an Akum, right? We know that. Why? Because the first time we see kinyan kesef is by Avram Avinu purchasing Rasa Machpila from Ephron Achiti, right? From an Akum. So I know that kesef works, and now I know that Meshicha works as well. So the Gemara says, you see from here that Meshicha ultimately again works by an akum. Okay, incredible. A story. Hu gavra. There was a guy. The Amr Lechavre, who said to his friend, Im mizabnina laha ara lacha mizabnina le. So we'll say, here's the case. Right? Reuven has a piece of land. Shimon wants to purchase the piece of land, the piece of real estate. Reuven's not really willing to sell right now. But what Reuven does tell Shimon is, Shimon, if I ever sell the land, I'm selling it to you. Makes no problem. So if I sell the land, I sell it to you. What happened, Abosai? It's a pretty predictable story. Right? So what happened? Reuven went and he sold it to Levi. Sold it to Levi and sold it to Shimon. So it says, obviously now Shimon's claiming, 1 second, you promised that if you would sell it to me. So what's the halacha over here? Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, halacha l'maisa kona kama. Ultimately, again, really Shimon has the right to it. It belongs to Shimon. Kona kama. Good. Amrli Abaye, v'halo pasak. Abaye said, 1 second. How can you say that Shimon acquires it? They never even spoke price. Right? See, both say there were 2 things we saw already from the last sugya. Number one is that really a seller is only committed to a transaction when price is agreed upon. That's number 1. And number 2, we saw that Meshicha works even by an akum. Okay, those are the 2 nuggets that we walked over with the previous sugya. So again, in this case, Abai said, what are you talking about? Although Reuven said, if I ever sell the land, I'll sell it to you, they never spoke price. If they never spoke price, how is there any level of commitment from Reuven to Shimon? So from where do you see that where there's not an agreement on price, essentially, there's not transactional commitment? Where do you see that from? Disnan, our Mishnah, if I sell my wine to an akum, pasak achelam madad damav mutarim. If we agree on price before the akum measured out the wine, then ultimately the proceeds are mutar. Why? Because again, agreement to sell because there's a set price. When the akum deals with the wine, it's his wine already. So whatever happens to it is not my problem. Therefore, the proceeds are mutar. Madad achala pasak damav asurin. But ultimately, again, if the akum begins to handle the wine before there is a set price, he's made it yayin esach in my possession, and therefore the proceeds are aser. So the Gemara says, "My havi Allah." So what's the result of this conversation? So we'll say, point is, what do you see from here? You see from here that a seller is only transactionally committed once price is established. So the Gemara says, "So my havi Allah." What's the resolution over here? The Gemara says, "My havi Allah kidikamra." What are you talking? We just said what the resolution is. The resolution is Where there is agreement on price, there is transactional commitment. And therefore, conversely, where there is no agreement on price, there is no transactional commitment. So what else do you want to talk about? The Gemara says, well, one second. Dilma chumra diyayin esach shayni. No. Maybe this is different. Because again, since yayin nesach is so chomer, maybe it's only by yayin nesach that ultimately, again, agreement on price represents transactional commitment. But maybe in other cases, even without an agreement on price, there is transactional commitment. So Tashma, so that's another side. There was an episode, there was a story that happened in the house of Rav Chisda, similar case to the one we just mentioned. Rav Chisda bei Rav Huna. And ultimately, again, Rav Chisda brought the Shaila to the base measure of Rav Huna. And what happens? And they went ahead and they answered it from the following case. This is interesting. Mashach chamarav upalav v'echnisan l'soch beisa. Supposed to listen to this. Let's say I want to acquire something from Ruvain. Right? So what do? I go ahead and let's say again, Ruvain has certain merchandise, and the merchandise is sitting on top of Ruvain's donkeys or in the hands of Ruvain's workers. So I do something interesting. I do Mashicha on the donkeys or Mashicha on the workers and pull them into my home. Okay, what's the halacha? Bein pasak ad shalom madad, ubein madad ad shalom pasak lo kana. So I'll say, so whether there was agreement on price, right, before I started taking stuff and measuring, whether there wasn't agreement on price, ultimately, again, I don't acquire anything, and halacha l'maisa, both of us can go ahead and retract from the, we can both walk away from the transaction. I will say now, what's the logic over here? The logic over here, ultimately, again, I will say, is that halacha l'maisa, I have not done anything directly with the items themselves, right? In other words, pulling the donkey upon which the items, the merchandise is situated, or pulling the workers that are carrying the merchandise is not a form of acquisition. However, the Gemara says, parkan, both say first wide line, parkan ve'echnisan l'soch beso. But again, if I unloaded the donkey, right, or took the merchandise out of the hands of the workers and then brought that into my home, then pasak ad shelo madad. If we agreed on a price, right, even though, again, I still have to go through the merchandise to see what there is, how much there is, but at that point, again, I will say, see, there's two things happening over here. Number one, agreement on price. Number two, I'm doing Mashicha, right? I'm doing Mashicha, ultimately, again, even though we still have to work out some details, right? It's not a done deal. We have to work out the details. Neither of us could renege. Madad ad shelo pasak. But again, if there's no agreement on price, and I'm just kind of looking through the merchandise, shneihen yecholin lachzor bahen. Both of us have the ability to go ahead and retract. So therefore, I will say what you see from here is something very important. It is only agreement on price that creates transactional commitment. Now again, we have to be careful with this, because that is not to say that you can't back out even once there's agreement on price. There is. In other words, I will say, this is a very different kind of case. In this case over here, let's say I'm buying, I don't know, pots. Pots from Ruvain. Now Ruvain's donkey is loaded with pots. So you say, okay, I'm gonna pay, $10 per pot. Now again, there's a whole bunch of stuff on the donkey. I don't know what it is that I'm taking, but in this case over here, we've agreed on price, and we've agreed ultimately again on item. I just have to kind of go through the merchandise and see what I'm taking. I can't renege. I can't get out on that. Right? I can't renege on that transaction. Now again, there are other cases of price where even if we agree on price, there's too much other transactional ambiguity, I could still back out. What the Gemara is highlighting over here is you need price. You need agreement on price in order to create transactional commitment. And therefore, failure to agree on price results in non-transactional commitment or non-commitment to the transaction. Good. Another case, therefore going back, remember again, how did this whole thing start? Shimon goes over to Reuven, sell me your property. Reuven says, I'm not selling it right now, but when I sell it, I'll sell it to you. And then Reuven goes and sells it to Levi. Bipashtos, Shimon doesn't really have any recourse on this, right? Why? There was never a discussion on price. So because there was never a discussion on price, ultimately, again, there's really no transactional commitment, at least based on what the Gemara is saying over here. Second white line. Ho Gavra. There was a guy who said to his friend, what did he say? Okay, so this case, a little bit more specific. So Shimon goes over to Reuven, sell me your field. Reuven says, I'm not selling. But if I do sell one day, I'll sell it to you for 100 zuz. Okay. Then Reuven went and sold it to Levi for 120 zuz. So obviously, Shimon's braigis, someone's always braigis. So Shimon's braigis, Amr of Kana, Kama. Of Kana, listen, it's Shimon's, it belongs to Shimon, right? Reuven promised Shimon that he would sell it. There was even an agreement on price. Nothing more to talk about. Maskel Rav Yaakov. So Nahar Pakod. So Rav Yaakov of Nahar Pakod said, 1 second, hold up. Hi, Zuzi in Sa'an Suhu. Sewa says it's very interesting. From the Gemara's perspective, it's not like today where people freely sell real estate. In times of the Gemara, you didn't sell your land. The only time you sold your land was when? When you were in financial distress. So listen to this. Rav Yaakov says, obviously, if Reuven is Shimon, if Reuven is selling, he's in financial distress. And if he's financial distress, he has the right to what? To what? To get the best price possible. And although, yeah, okay, he made a promise to sell to Shimon. But really what he was saying is, I made a promise to sell to Shimon because I thought 100 zuz is the best I can get for this land. But if it turns out I can get more, then again, I will say, if it's free market, halacha is not going to restrict Reuven's ability to get more for his property. Therefore, Rabbi Yaakov says, Shimon can be braigis, but ultimately, again, he has absolutely no recourse. He has no recourse. Ultimately, again, and I will say, the whole, if you look at Rashi says over here, Zuzi Ansu, Zeshenosin lo mea ve'esin, Ansu l'makro, v'chol kamadol yav kuli hai, lo have bedaiti l'zabnu, v'ihu lo mzamno le b'shavi kamar. I was about to say, the way Rabbi Yaakov says it like this. When Reuven says to Shimon, if I sell, I'll sell to you for 100 zuz. What was Reuven saying? He was saying, I believe 100 zuz to be the price that the market will give. So we'll say, how much is real estate worth? How much is real estate worth? Whatever people are willing to pay. So therefore, the fact that ultimately, again, now Reuven could get 120 zuz indicates to us that that's what it's worth. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, Reuven has every right to sell it for the higher price. Rabbi Yaakov, ultimately, again, that he can go ahead and sell it to Levi for 120 zuz. Amrlei, kideshaymi bitlasas. Listen to this. Well, some other cases over here. Let's say, if you look at Rashi says over here, Amrlei kideshaymi bitlasa, bezabnino man nahalach, kivan denakit lishna deshuma v'nakat tlasa shein bezdin. So listen to this. So Reuven is selling something to Shimon, and he says, let's have the item assessed, right? Evaluated, assessed. Ultimately, there's a better word, appraised. Thank you. Appraised, ultimately, again, bitlasa, with 3. And I remember again, what's 3? 3 is a bezdin. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, "Afilu train me go tlasa." Ultimately, again, really, let's say again, in that group of 3, in that bezdin, you have 2 who agree on a certain valuation, a certain appraisal, and 1 who does not. We follow the 2. Just like the way a bezdin works, right? In a bezdin in general, you don't need unanimity, right? What you need is majority. You need majority. So therefore, again, if you get 2 out of the 3, that's good. However, the Gemara says, Kid amri bitlasa, but if he uses this lashon, so you will say, Kid shayn bitlasa is an appraisal. That makes it sound like he's utilizing a bezdin. So therefore, again, the group of 3 will work like a bezdin. All you need is majority. If he says Kid amri bitlasa, as 3 say, then you need unanimity in the appraisal. Ad amri bitlasa. So the Gemara says, good. Kid amri bitlasa, ad amri bitlasa. Kid shaymi barba. So I said this is very interesting. So if he says, well, let's submit to an appraisal by 4. So 4 is an interesting number. Why? Because it's not a bezdin. So if you're choosing a number like 4, then obviously what you're saying is, I want the appraisal to be unanimous, and therefore again, ad amri barba. So ultimately, the appraisal is only going to be binding if halacha l'maisa again all 4 agree. V'kol shekein heichad da'amrlei ki da'amri barba. And all the more so if you use lashon of as 4 would say. Amrlei. Listen to this. So let's say Reuven said to Shimon, I'm going to sell you the property, and let's do it as 3 would appraise it. Kedeshayim b'tlasa. Ultimately, again, va'asu tlasa vishamua, and ultimately, again, 3 came along. So 3 people appraised it. Va'amale idach leisu tlasa achrini dekimlu tvei. And what happens? Shimon says, you know what, I have another Beis Din, right? I have another 3 guys who I think could do a better job of appraisal. Some Rapapa says, Dinohu dema'akiv. So no, Shimon has a right to go ahead and suggest his other appraisal Beis Din. Maskil for Rav Huna ben Rav Yoshua, mimai dahani kimlu tfei. How do you, what are you doing, right? You're going to start with this, that no, there's a better group of appraisal, now get on both sides. Obviously, if Shimon comes along and says, listen, the first 3 who appraised, they don't know what they're talking about, or they made a mistake like this, and he could prove that it wasn't a good appraisal, that's one thing. But just stam to say, I'll bring another appraisal body, so ultimately, again, Rav Huna says, how do you know? Who says that the second 3 are better than the first 3? The Gemara says, therefore, Rav Huna says, unless Shimon could demonstrate in a material way that the first group was flawed, the appraisal of the first group stands. V'hilchasa, Rav Huna ben Yoshua. And I both say that is the halacha. That is the halacha. So when they submit to an appraisal by a certain group of 3, that appraisal stands, unless, of course, one of the parties could show that for some reason that appraisal itself was flawed. Says the Mishnah, the suppose it's a very interesting case. So let's say again, I am selling wine ultimately again to an akum. So what do? I take my funnel and I pour wine into the jug of the akum. Okay, so now watch this. And then I go ahead and I take that same funnel to pour wine into my jug. So what's the halacha? Im yesh bo akeves. Essentially, if there's a lip on the bottom of the funnel, the Gemara says yain aser. Then ultimately, again, my wine is going to be asr. Now, bepashtos, what it sounds like is happening over here is that we are concerned that somehow some of the wine that I poured for the akum, that somehow became yayin esech. It's not immediately clear what the problem over here is. Then it got transferred over to my wine, right? Then I put the funnel in my barrel, or I put the funnel, whatever, in my wine jug. And therefore, again, some of the yayin esech gets mixed in with my wine. That's what it sounds like is happening over here, but we'll see in the Gemara. Hama'ara mikli al kli, ashira mered mutar, v'ashira l'socha aser. If you pour from one utensil to another, the one you are pouring from, right, is going to be mutar, and the one you're pouring into is going to be aser. Okay, so we'll have to see exactly what that case is talking about. So let's analyze. So Tnan Hasam. So we learned elsewhere. Hanitzok vakatafros umashke tofeach ein achibar. So this is very interesting. So we learned elsewhere. Nitzok. Nitzok is a pour, right? A direct downward pour. So you're pouring from utensil A to utensil B in a straight downward stream. That's nitzok. Kitafros. Rashi says over here is Mayim haboin milamala lamata derech madron. This is a stream of liquid that goes down. Let's say, you can imagine like a stream of liquid down a mountain, right, or down a hill. So it's a slanted direct stream. Okay, or mashke tofiach, So if you look at Rashi over here, mashke tofiach ultimately it's in the middle of that Rashi. Well, let's just say it outside. Oh no, sorry, mashke tofiach. Rashi says is here 4 lines up from the bottom. 5 lines from the bottom. Ve'imbo tofiach amras latfiach. So ultimately, again, this is a case of where you have moisture, but it's not moist enough to make something else wet. In all of these cases, eno chibor, these streams of liquid are not considered to be a connection, lo latuma v'lo latara. So for example, if you have a downward stream, right, and the upper item is tameh, and the downward item is tahar, that stream does not create ultimately a connection between these 2 items. Same thing with a stream of liquid flowing down a mountain. Same thing ultimately again with just liquid. There's even stationary liquid, but the liquid itself is not moist enough to make something else wet. So these things do not create a connection for tumantara. On the other hand, hashboren chibor l'tumalatara. Ashboren. What's ashboren? Rashi says, second line down from the bottom. Rashi hashboren. Bikua eretz malicha shenisbaka v'nikvu shama mayim chibur l'tumatara. I would say this is really just, if you think about it, almost like a stationary pool of water, right? If you have a stationary bit of water, ultimately, again, this will create a connection. That stationary body of water will create a connection for Tumah and Tara purposes. In other words, so if you can imagine, if you have a Tameh item on one end, a tar item on the other end, and they're both touching the water ultimately, again, creates a connection between the two, thereby rendering the tahar item Tameh. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Good. Fine. I'm sorry. Rafuna says, Nitzok v'kitafros umash ketofeach chibor le'inyin yayin nesach. Oh, Rafuna comes along and he says, no, these first three, the Nitzok, which is the downward stream, Kitafros, which is, if you could imagine, the stream that runs down, let's say, the side of a mountain, side of a hill, umashke tofeach, and ultimately, again, liquid that is wet enough to has enough moisture to convey moisture to a second item. Although these items do not create connection for tumah purposes, they do create connection for yayin nesech purposes. Now, the Gemara says, so therefore, just so you understand, what would that mean? What that would mean is, if you were, let's see. So I'm going to Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said to Rafuna, where do you know this from? From where do you know this? If it's from our Mishnah, Hanitzok v'aketafros umash ketofeach eno chibor lo l'tuma v'lo l'tara. So if it's in the Mishnah that we just mentioned, then Nitzok ketafros and mash ketofeach does not create the connection for tumah and Zara. L'tumah and Tara hu delo havichibor hale'inyin yayin nesech havichibor. Also, you infer from here that these three items do not create connection for tumah and Tara, but they do create connection ultimately for what? For yayin nesach. If that's the case, ema seifa, look at the seifa, hashboren, right? The hashboren is just the sitting body of water. Chibor l'tumah l'tara. That does create connection to tumah and Tara. Would you infer from that the tumah l'tara da havichibor hala yayin nesach lo havichibor? Would you say it's only for tumah and Tara and not for yayin nesach? Ella. You're right, you can't infer anything from here. So the Gemara says, we'll say, so just understand what's happening over here. We're trying to figure out, imagine the following case. Imagine you have a kli that ultimately, again, was used for yayin nesach, and now ultimately, again, there is a stream of wine coming from that kli into a regular, called tahar kli, a regular Jewish utensil. Does that stream create a connection ultimately, again, between the two items or not? That's what we're trying to figure out over here. What's the nature of a stream, and therefore what type of stream creates connection? And what we're beginning to see is that connectivity issue really has two different ramifications, both for tumah and Tara as well as for yayin nesach. The Gemara says, Tinan, let's analyze. Natal as mishpach. This is our Mishnah. If you took a funnel, umadad l'soch tzluchis or shalvit chochavim, v'chazer umadad l'soch tzluchis or shalvit. Suppose this is our Mishnah. I have a funnel, right? I have two things. I'm a Jew with a funnel, right? So what happens? I go ahead and I'm selling wine to an akum. So what do? I take my wine and I take my funnel. I put my funnel into the jug of the akum, and I go ahead and I pour wine for the akum. So what did the Mishnah say? I'll say, I'm a base, 72b. What did the Mishnah say? If the funnel has a lip, yayin aser, then ultimately, again, the wine is going to be aser. So the Gemara says, akeves yayin b'mai kamisra. So I'll say, the Gemara now unpacks this case. Let's left, right? Why? I don't understand. Why does now obviously what the Mishnah is saying is like this. If I go ahead and I take my funnel, right? I put my funnel into the jug of the akum. I then pour the wine, right? And then I take that same funnel and I bring it into my utensil to pour wine also. So the Mishnah says, if the funnel has a lip, it's going to aser my wine. Now, obviously, what the Mishnah is saying is because what are we afraid of? That there's some wine from the first pour for the akum that gets stuck in the lip, and therefore, if I bring it into my utensil, it's going to make it aser. Now, the Gemara says, I understand. Why is the wine left over in the lip from the pour for the akum? Why is that wine aser? Right? What made that wine aser? The Gemara says, "B'mai kamisri lav b'nitzuk." It must be through the pour. In other words, I will say it's through the flow. In other words, because what's happening over here? See, think about this just a moment. I'm pouring my wine through my funnel into the kli of the akum. Now, the assumption is what's on the bottom? Even before I start that pour, what's on the bottom of the utensil of the akum? What's there? Droplets of his previous wine. What's the status of that wine? Yayin esech. So now I'm pouring my wine through the funnel, right, in the utensil of the akum, which means now there's a stream. That stream, right, the bottom part of that stream is hitting where? The bottom of the utensil of the akum, which has droplets of yayin esech. The top of that stream is where? Is in my funnel. And therefore, again, the bottom stream is connected to the droplets that are held back in the lip of the funnel. And therefore, that stream connects the droplets on the bottom to the droplets ultimately in the lip. So there, and makes it what? Makes the droplets in the lip yayin nesech. When I then go ahead and take out the funnel, put it into my jug, pour wine now, yayin nesech. It answers everything because of droplets. So what do you see from here? You see from here that a stream does create connectivity between that which is on top and that which is on the bottom. That's the Gemara says, Shma mina nitzuk chibur. See from here that a stream or a flow creates a connection ultimately again between that which is above and that which is below. So Tani Reb Chia, because we're saying, hold up, maybe the issue with the lip is something different. Tani Reb Chia, No. Maybe the case is not with flow connectivity, right? But rather, or stream connectivity, but rather what's happening over here? I'm pouring my wine for the akum, right? So again, my funnel in his jug, and what ends up happening, Abosai? I end up filling up the wine so high in his jug that his wine, the wine level, goes above my funnel. Now, not totally above my funnel, but above the bottom of my funnel, which has a lip. So this has nothing to do with flow. This has to do our stream. This has everything to do with actual direct contact of wine. So now, say this makes a little bit more sense. Now, halacha l'maisa, the akum's wine is surrounding the bottom of my funnel. So if there's no lip on the bottom of my funnel, who cares, right? In other words, I'll just pull it out and we're good to go. But if there is a lip on the bottom of my funnel, now I really do have a potential issue because some of those residual droplets are going to be left in the bottom of my funnel. Incredible. So the Gemara says, but if I did not fill up the wine level to the bottom of my funnel, then what's the halacha? Lo, it's not going to be a problem. Really, in that case, again, it's actually not a problem. To which the Gemara says, okay, tifshot, chibur. What do you see from here? That a flow does not create connectivity. In other words, you have no raya from here that stream creates connectivity. To which the Gemara says, lo, pachastut tzluchiso, tifshot lecha, the aser, nitzok tibai. The Gemara says, not necessarily. It could very well be that obviously in a case where the actual wine level in the akum's jug is above the lip of my funnel, obviously everyone agrees that that's going to be problematic. But that doesn't change the point that there's still a shayla about flow. What's the status of flow? So tashma, hamar mikli likli, supposed to say if a person's pouring from one utensil to another utensil, the Gemara says, as shema'ara mimena mutar. So ultimately, again, remember this was the Mishnah, which this last case of the Mishnah, which we don't even know what this means yet. Hey, so if I'm pouring from one kli to another, as shema'ara mimena mutar, the kli that you are pouring from is mutar. Ha de beini aser. But yet, say we see from here that what? That which is in the middle, right? Ultimately, again, is going to be aser. Shmamina nitzak chibur. See from here, ultimately, again, that a flow or a stream creates connectivity. In nitzach chibur. So if that's true that the flow creates connectivity, afilu degave mana nami lissar. Then ultimately, again, I will say, even that which is outside of the kli, ultimately, again, should be aser as well. To which the Gemara says, halokasha tikamaktif kitufe. So I will say, this is very interesting. It could very well be that in this case, which again, the Gemara has not exactly clarified what this case is, but it could very well be that the way you're pouring in this case, I will say, is fascinating, is in spurts, right? When you pour, there are two ways you could pour. You could pour with continuous stream, so that there is a stream that is connecting utensil A to utensil B, or you could pour in spurts, right? What happens when you pour? I would do it, but we have a lid obligation in the base medrash, good opportunity to reinforce the rules, right? And go ahead, right? So let's say, so you could pour in spurts, right? So what does it mean to pour in spurts? You I don't know what the right term is, you jerk the kli, if that's the right, right? A quick flick of the wrist. And interestingly enough, if you were to watch that in slow motion, what that does is it transfers the liquid from A to B without a continuous stream. So ultimately, again, the liquid is transferred, but there's no connection between A and B. So therefore, I will say, in that kind of case, everyone would agree that even if you say that nitzik is chibur, right? Even if you say that a stream creates connectivity, ultimately, again, if you have that spurt pouring, ultimately there's no connectivity over there. Mikomakom nitzik chibur, but it could still very well be that a general stream will create connectivity. According to your reasoning, Amos Seifel, look at the end of the Mishnah. Es she'ira l'socha hu da'aser had beni beni shari. Again, I will say the end of the Mishnah, which says that when you're pouring, the upper kli remains mutter, it's only the lower one, but again, still anything that's in the middle, the beni beni, ultimately is going to be permitted. You can't understand that, right? You can't draw ultimately again any kind of conclusion from that case. So Tashma, let's analyze. Hama'ara mechaves libar. If a person ultimately again is pouring from a barrel into a bar. Bar means like a cistern, a pit. So what's the halacha will say? Kiluach hayored misfas chavis lemata aser. Ultimately, again, about say any flow that comes from the edge of the barrel going downwards is going to be aser. So from here you see that obviously again a stream has connectivity. Tergemar of Sheshes ba'ovid kochavim hama'ara. Oh, what's the case over here? Sirba said this whole time we thought that it was a Jew who was doing the pour. It turns out that it's actually an akum who's doing the pour. And the akum, therefore, the pour is coming as a result of the koach of the akum. To which the Gemara says, but one second, if it's the akum that's doing the pour, then why is it only the stream that's asr? Why not say the contents of barrel number 1 are asr as well? Rabbi said this is very important. Now remember, let's take a step back just for a minute. How does wine become yayin nesach? How does it become yayin nesach? What has to happen? Or stam yayin, what has to happen? Touch what? The wine, right? Touching the container does not make it yayin nesach. So the Gemara says something very interesting over here. The Gemara says, so we'll say, so now, by the way, we've seen this before, but we are being reintroduced to a new concept, which is that when wine flows as the result of the koach, of the energy of an akum, that wine now becomes asur midrabanan. But that rabbinic prohibition was only on what? On wine that leaves the container, not on the wine in the container. So this is fascinating. So when an akum goes ahead and pours wine, and the wine is moving as a result of his koach, the flow which emerges is going to be asr. But the contents of the barrel or the container will remain mutter. Watch this. The Gemara says, this idea that wine that moves as a result of the koach of an akum, that ultimately is midrabanan. The Gemara says, the aser hahu denafak librai, hahu denafak librai gazru beirabanan. Hahu delegavai lo gazru beirabanan. It is only the liquid that flowed outside, ultimately again, that is asr midrabanan, but the liquid or the wine, ultimately again, that is inside, ultimately again, remains mutter. So we'll have to stop over here for today. So ultimately again, this is very interesting because I will say this now opens up there's a Mishnah on the top of Ayin Gimel, but this opens up just a new conversation for the remainder over here, which is suddenly now there's a new idea. I mean, it's not new, we've seen it before, but Allah Lamaisa, again, originally, obviously direct contact with wine, yayin nesach. Now we're being told that Allah Lamaisa, if the akum causes the wine to move from his koach, that also is asur midrabanan, but that only applies on wine that moves out of the utensil because of his koach, but the wine that remains in the utensil ultimately again is going to be mutter. That's why I said just very quickly, that's why the last case of the Mishnah, what are we talking about? What was the last case? The akum is pouring wine from utensil A to utensil B. Oh, so now, what did the Mishnah say? The wine in utensil A remains mutter. The wine in utensil B is aser. Why? Because again, that flow is aser midrabanan because it's flowing as a result, ultimately, of Yaakov. Okay, we'll say to be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach, everyone. What a week. Shkoyach. All right, Chevra on Zoom. Have a wonderful day and a good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos. Shabbos.